just want to thank our speaker, Dr. Bostic, for being here with us. I don't have to say much about him, just understand that what he says can literally move markets globally. And so obviously when we're talking about leadership, it makes sense. But I do want to say one personal story about leadership because I think it's relevant. Raphael and I first got to know each other when I was his TA in graduate school. Unfortunately, he was smarter than I was, so it wasn't clear which way the knowledge. But one of the things, I've served in various roles, academic leadership and research leadership over the past 2 decades. And there are very few people that someone like me can turn to for advice and mentorship and leadership. And I put him in that rare group, and I'm very appreciative because he always has excellent advice. So thank you, Raphael. And thank you, Professor David Sloane, for leading the conversation. So now, without further ado, the next warm-up band, I'm going to introduce Dr. Douglas Bradburn. He's the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon and the former founding director, pause, for the Fred Smith National Library for the study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. But he's an accomplished author and a historian in his own right, and he'll provide some historical context for this. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradburn.
It's an honor to be here. I love coming out here. It's such an extraordinary place. And I always love the mission of the Saul Price School, which is to make the world a better place. Did I get that right? I mean, that's a mission that everybody can agree with. Let's have a round of applause for the mission of the Saul Price. So yes, I am here to get my pound of flesh out of everyone. I'll give you some historical context before we have a lovely conversation that can move markets. So get your phones ready. But we really do need to take a step back and think about, in the context of leadership, in a moment that we're in this country right now, where we're facing some crises and we're facing a society now where a lot of Americans, when they're polled, they say we're on the wrong track. They're polled. They say that they think that none of our institutions are functioning well. They're all polling at historic lows. The presidency, the Congress, the academic world, the university world, the media, even the military, the Supreme Court, areas that typically are very high. And so that's an important question when we think about how are we going to be able collectively to solve big problems together. And I want to go back and frame our independence story a little differently. So I would suggest, and I'm going to suggest in my 15 minutes here, that George Washington, the father of the country, is critical in 3 revolutions that established the independence of the United States. The first revolution is the political revolution, in which the United States of America declared themselves independent of Great Britain, and they won that 8-year war that basically answered the question. So the political revolution, he's of course the commander-in-chief, he's critical in that. The second revolution is the constitutional revolution, in which the more perfect union is created in the Constitution at 1787 in Philadelphia, put in place in 1789. And of course, he's the president of the Constitutional Convention. He's critical in the ratification of the Constitution. That's the Constitution we work under and live under today as a collective entity, a great experiment in democracy, as Washington called it, the last great experiment in human happiness under civil society, is actually the correct quote. But there's a third revolution, which is the one I want to talk about tonight, which is the financial revolution, which established the true economic independence of the United States of America, so that it wasn't just another developing economy, post-colonial economy that would be the plaything of foreign capital that would dictate to a struggling nation with lots of natural resources but very few capital resources, would tell them and control them, which has happened to so many other small republics and other nations that haven't found a way to master their own resources. And so the financial revolution is one I want to focus on tonight. So when you think about how the Americans funded, how did we fund our independence struggle, the war struggle? We did it on borrowed money. We borrowed money from foreign countries. We borrowed money from creditors in country. We borrowed money from the soldiers who fought the war, who were given promises that they would be paid at some future date by the United States. We did it by printing money. We printed a lot of money that became pretty worthless pretty soon, and oftentimes we paid these debts to soldiers and others in worthless money. It was not a great success. And then after independence, there was what many historians and economists now call the greatest depression America had other than the 1930s, or in fact equivalent to the 1930s. And I'll quote, really, I'm not going to go into it, but essentially, with monetary scarcity produced a deflation cycle that devastated an American economy already suffering from the impact of war, trade reduction, and burst speculative consumer good bubble. And so what you saw was a country in which there was no money circulating at all. There was no trade available because America was locked out of the mercantilist system of the British imperial world, the Spanish imperial world, the French, even our allies. There was no capital or credit flowing. And so that's the state of the world when George Washington becomes president in 1789. And one of the things that happens in his administration is this remarkable financial revolution. And there are three things I want to talk about that are critical to the success of Americans establishing their economic independence. The first is the policies that they put into place. The second is the rule of law. And the third is a little more magical. It's trust. It's a funny thing called trust, and how do you find it, and where do you find it in leadership? So let's start with the policies of the Washington administration. You've all seen the musical. Alexander Hamilton is the guy. He's the first Secretary of the Treasury, actually Washington's third pick for Secretary of the Treasury. Nobody wanted this job because the country was in big trouble. But this young man had been working very hard. And so the first thing he did in his vision for the financial stability of the country was he wanted to create a proper national debt. And what I mean by that is a debt that would be funded by a permanent requisition of Congress that would replace a lot of these old promises and old paper of the Continental Army. So like I said, we borrowed a lot of money under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress that fought the war. And these loans were given by the French government. They were given by bankers in the Netherlands. There were creditors in states. There were state debts. There were these promises to soldiers that had been unpaid. So it's a range of different types of paper that were out there, obligations that had not been paid. They'd not been paid regularly, and when they were paid, oftentimes they were paid with currency that wasn't worth anything. And so what Hamilton did was the whole of that debt was going to be refinanced. And then it was going to be serviced by Treasury bonds that would pay interest. So interest-bearing Treasury bonds that would pay gold and silver, specie payments every quarter. So this created, from what had been a debt that had been a drag and a challenge, it created actually a possible engine for investment and the creation of capital, because these Treasury bonds, of course, are incredible assets. And the two things about them that are so special is, one is they're going to pay specie regularly every quarter, so that's going to affect the money supply, which is a real problem in a post-colonial economy. But also, they will serve as a stable collateral for loans, and they're going to be critical for other kinds of investment over time. Now, this is very controversial, because basically what Hamilton wants to do is he wants to say that we're going to pay all the people that are owners of paper, of continental debt, and we're going to pay them at face value. And this is very politically frustrating for a lot of people, because a lot of those debts, so say that the dean here was a soldier in Pennsylvania, and for his service, he was given an IOU for $100. I'm going to pay you $100, United States. It's about some future. That's about what he gets at some future date. And he was never paid. And all he had was this piece of paper. He goes back home to his farm, and he's broke, and they need to make ends meet. And then there's a sharp who comes around and says, I'm going to buy that promise from you. I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar, because you're not going to ever see any money for that. And that was a good bet in the 1780s, because there was no money to give. The Articles of Confederation government had no ability to tax. There was no ability to raise any money to actually pay that promise, and it didn't look like it would ever happen. So somebody comes around saying, I'm going to give you 10 cents on the dollar. People start giving their certificates to these people who are collecting them. And so when Hamilton said he wanted to make sure that all of the guarantees that the U.S. government were paid at face value, this was seen as immoral in some ways, that essentially you need to discriminate between the original holders of the debt and then the speculators who had accumulated all this. And so that's one reason it's very controversial. And the second one is Hamilton also wants to assume all the state debts. So a lot of the states that fought the war had their own debt. So we're going to create a national debt out of all this Revolutionary War debt. So the state of Massachusetts, the state of Virginia, they had their own debts from fighting the war. In Virginia, they had paid off their debt, but in Massachusetts, they hadn't. And so that's controversial because the Virginians said, well, why are we going to assume the Massachusetts debt? We've already paid off our debt. I mean, this is like, I'm a Virginian. If we assume the California debt right now and said we're going to pay it off, that would be a big issue, right? But Washington famously said it was an honorable debt that was formed in war, and so it's the obligation of all of us as a nation to pay it. And so they assumed the state debt. But that's where that great compromise comes into play, where they're going to assume the debts, they're going to fund them at par. So those are the two deals. So you're going to assume the debt and fund them at par and create this new national debt. And the deal was that to get that done, the capital of the United States would be put on the banks of the Potomac. So that was if you know the musical Hamilton, that's In the Room Where It Happened. That's the song In the Room Where It Happened. So this is a critical part of the Union, figuring out how they're going to establish this system. So that fundamentally was a great success. Now, the other part of the program of Hamilton's policies is the creation of a national bank. And it's an interesting bank because it's only 1/5 owned by the government. So it has this public-private aspect to it. It's capitalized at $10 million. A fifth of it's owned, the stock in that bank is owned by the people, by the U.S. government, and the rest is sold in open market. And this bank is going to be a very special thing because they're encouraging people to buy stock in that bank using these new securities, these bonds that trade at 6% or 3%, these new bonds that are funding this debt. And so they're therefore sealing into that bank this new system of credit. And it's an incredible thing because when Hamilton took the state debts over, the other thing that happened was all these creditors to the states who were, they had debt that the state owed them, so they really worry about the state paying them regularly. Well, now all of a sudden, that's debt that's owed by the federal government. And so they're very interested now. They're literally interested in the success of the Washington administration. So he transfers their allegiance from the states to the nation, which is a critical thing because this is an untested new government. So the wealthiest people in the country are now connected to the national government and these policies in a fundamental way. But the bank then is established, and the bank is established, of course, to help stabilize the market in these securities and in bank stock, and the bank can issue banknotes as well. So it basically mobilizes this debt, which had been a drag, and monetizes it and creates a circulating currency for the country. So the policies are extraordinary and they're far-sighted. He also creates a sinking fund, which is going to pay off the debt over time, but it's also going to allow them to manipulate the market in both securities and also bank stock, where they can make purchases in the open market. There's a secondary market for these Treasury notes because they are so stable that develops very rapidly. And so you get a modern financial system created, which has mobilized all this debt into capital that can be used for investment, that's going to be used to lend out money and really allow for Americans to develop the natural resources in the nation. When you think about countries that won their independence and have the same constitution, I think about Mexico. In 1824, has almost the identical constitution of the United States of America, controls more natural resources and more territory than the United States did in 1790, but they don't have a financial system that's independent of British capital or French capital until the 20th century, and even then, it's beholden. They don't have a national bank until the 1910s. And so they're invaded multiple times. They can't invest in the development of their own resources. They don't establish that independence from foreign capital that the Americans established in this Washington administration. But those are just the policies. I want to talk about the second critical thing that makes it come to life, and that's the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is a critical thing here. And the first thing I've already mentioned, it relates to it, was Hamilton arguing that you needed to pay at the face value of all these obligations that the nation had made. In the war, you've made an obligation for the dean to pay him $100, but he sold it off to somebody at 10 cents on the dollar, so you're going to pay that person $100. And you're going to pay him $100 because it says the United States will pay you $100. That's a contract that has to be upheld. That you can't just decide that you're not going to pay the face value of these things because morally, why are you going to pay this speculator the same amount that this person that fought and bled? But the contract matters, and that was critical because it created a sense that you could trust what would happen and this nation's promises would be kept up. But the other really critical thing about this system was that it had to be funded by taxation. And that's a new thing. Because you've never had a continent-wide tax system in North America that had worked. The British had tried it. It led to a revolution. The Articles of Confederation couldn't do it. And so the Constitution allowed it, but could you actually put it into place? Well, so most of it's going to be funded by what we call customs duties. So essentially merchants bringing in goods are going to pay the taxes here. But there's another tax that's part of this critical system. Because remember, Hamilton's got to pay out in specie every quarter on these notes. That gold and silver has to arrive, and you've got to collect that from somewhere. And there's an excise tax on, among other things, whiskey. And so whiskey production. So this is a whiskey production tax. It's not a sin tax. It's a tax on producing whiskey, and it has to be paid in hard money. And it's really unfair for the people who live in western Pennsylvania. These are poor farmers who have no access to market except when they distill their corn into a jar and carry it over the mountains. And they don't have the money to pay this tax, but they're being taxed. And so the question is, are you going to enforce the collection of this unfair tax? Because it's a constitutional tax. The Congress has every right to pass this tax. It's certainly legal, but you have an insurrection that happens in western Pennsylvania. So what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to say, well, it's not really a fair tax. We're not going to enforce the tax. Maybe they'll change the tax. George Washington, when he reads the Constitution, it says that he's required to make sure the laws are faithfully executed. And he marches an army into western Pennsylvania to make sure that tax is enforced. Now, nobody dies. There isn't any there isn't any system of bureaucracy to help collect that tax. And so it seems dramatic to a 21st century eye. But what it did was assure that the laws that were passed, and particularly laws related to revenue, would be effective because essentially they did collect that tax and it was effective. Eventually the law was changed to ameliorate it. But that was a critical component of the success of the financial revolution. You have lots of governments who pass laws, but if they don't execute them, they don't collect them, again, you can't invest in countries that you can't depend will live up to the promises that they make to their own citizens. And that leads me to my final point, which is the question. Actually, let me read a quote from Washington real quick to set the stage here for the collection of that tax. He says, "What may be the consequence of such violent and outrageous proceedings is painful in a high degree, even in contemplation. But if the laws are to be so trampled upon with impunity, and a minority, and a small one too, is to dictate to the majority, there's an end put at one stroke to Republican government, and nothing but anarchy and confusion is to be expected thereafter. For some other man or society may dislike another law and oppose it with equal propriety, until all laws are prostrate and every one, the strongest I presume, will carve for himself." It's a critical aspect. When you have a society that creates the laws, even when they're bad laws, they get enforced until they can be changed. So finally then, the third component I mentioned is trust. What does it mean, the full faith and credit of the United States at the time Washington is elected president, when they'd never have paid any of their obligations? There isn't any full faith and credit. It's George Washington. He's the most trusted politician in the country. He's elected unanimously in the Electoral College. He's trusted because he had given up power at the end of the American Revolutionary War. He had done what he said, and then he went back to Mount Vernon. He had developed that trust, and Washington's reputation and integrity was critical in the survival, the fundamental survival in the system. And I'll give you an example. Hamilton's financial plans were modern and exciting, and they also created financial panics. In fact, when the bank opened up, the bank started selling its stock on July 4th, 1791, an open sale, and they sold for $25 per share. By August of that year, they were selling at $325 a share. There was a huge speculation and enthusiasm, and as you see, and then of course there was the inevitable crash, and people had been borrowing on credit, and particularly had been using these new Treasury bonds as collateral on the loans they take out to buy this stock that they promised that they'd be able to sell, and of course they couldn't. And so then what you have is a possible cascading destruction of the whole system. And so Hamilton steps in and provides liquidity. He purchases in the open market these Treasury bonds that have been selling off rapidly as this collateral is sold off. And that's wonderful, except for the fact that he runs out of money. He's got $500,000 to hold up the market for the first panic. And there's another panic in 1792, and he only has $50,000 left. And so what does he do? Well, he instructs his agent to buy what he can with $50,000, but to make sure that everybody knows that George Washington is guaranteeing that this market will be held up. He uses the reputation of Washington, that he agrees with this system as a way to inject trust and liquidity into this magical scenario that he's faced with. So trust matters, and Washington's reputation and integrity is critical. And here's what John Jay said at the end of Washington, talking about Washington's presidency actually a decade later. He writes, his administration raised the nation out of confusion into order, out of degradation and distress into reputation and prosperity. It found us withering, it left us flourishing. America's economic independence has always, I think, been a critical balance between those things: policies, the rule of law, and trust. In an era of distrust, I'm eager to hear from these two gentlemen how we are going to maintain our integrity and independence in the face of this world. Reporters, get ready, because here we are for the main event. That's the lead-up act, and it was pretty good. You're about to get something else. We got Raphael Bostic and Professor Sloane. Please come on up to the stage here. Let's go.
So I'm tempted to start with the whole trust thing. Not a question on my list, but trust is so important. Trust was important for Washington and Hamilton, but I think it's, if anything, more important now, given the deep political polarization, social polarization, cultural polarization of our society, financial polarization of our society, and the equities. How does one, in your position, obviously, you're not a politician. I'm not asking about that. You're not a political commentator. I'm not asking about that. But how does a president of a Federal Reserve Bank think about trust in the way that you take action?
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. It's really good to be back on campus. And
I suppose I should have done that, shouldn't I?
yeah, probably. But it's a very good question.
So let me start over and say, would we all welcome back our former colleague, our friend, our delightful personality, who's now the president of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. I'm not going to go through his credits. You have a bio in your little thing, and okay. So let's answer the question.
Yeah. So, how to answer this in sort of an eloquent way? Here's what I would say. What I have found in my time in this role is that there was a lot of trust and credibility that had been built up in our institution over many, many years. You know, when the Fed said they were going to do something, they did it. They often did it in the face of tremendous political pressure. and did things that were at times unpopular, and people noticed that. And so over the last 5 years, I've gone around and I talked to business leaders. They tell us the truth because they know that we'll be responsible with it. When I talk to bankers, they tell us exactly what they're seeing because they have confidence that we will take that information and do the things that we think are right. And when we talk to people in communities, just regular families, and they tell us what they're seeing and how they're struggling, they do that with an expectation that we won't take that and try to leverage that to our own individual benefit or to sort of advantage the institution in ways that may not advance the country. And so I really try to keep that relationship. There's a contract that we have with the American people to be responsible, to tell people exactly what we know, to tell people what we think it means, and to do it in a clear and transparent way that then translates into policy. You know, I will say it's been very interesting. You talked about all of the polarization, all of the tension, all of the discord in terms of how people are trying to address the challenges that we have in this country. I've been in more meetings where people say, you know, thank God there's the Fed, because you don't do those things, and you're consistently the adult that goes out and does the hard things that need to be done, and so we need to continue to do that, and I'm going to continue to do that in terms of my approach. And another thing that I really try to do, and we're probably going to talk about this down the road, but people watch all the time. And it's something that I was not really totally attuned to when I took this job. You know, when you're a faculty member, Dana, you're the dean, don't listen to this part, but like in faculty meetings, there'll be times when you just don't have to pay attention. You can go and sit in the back and do other things because it's not really your space, and there are times when you can be relatively invisible. In these roles, you're never invisible. And so you have to make sure that how you project and how you engage and how you talk and interact is consistent over an arc of time, because people will also notice if you're starting to tell different people different things. And that can undermine your credibility as well. So I try really hard to not do that. And you know, I try to talk the same way in every environment and really try to engage. And it's been great.
Has it become harder?
Harder? So no, but yes. So you know, no in the sense that I think, you know, it's interesting. In our bank, we've been talking a lot about how do you develop leadership characteristics and qualities. And part of the conversation is you need to know who you are. You need to understand your brand. You need to understand how you bring value to every situation. If you know those things and you own it and you lean into it, then it's not hard to do the things that we were just talking about. But what has been more difficult in the recent years is that we've just had crazy things happen. Like things that we would never have imagined could be possible. Like I didn't really know what a pandemic was before we had it. And the things that are going on in terms of Europe and the war there are things that hadn't happened in like 40 or 50 years at this scale. And so it's causing me to have to speak to things that are not in sort of Econ 101 textbooks. And we're kind of having to evolve our understanding and appreciation of what's going on, as well as the implications for policy in real time. That's harder. And it means that you have to, that I have to be much more purposeful and intentional in terms of the narratives that I'm telling, and being honest about when I really don't know things, and that, you know, the world has got to happen in order for us to get a deeper understanding.
So, sending our sympathies to the Ukrainian people. I would like to ask, you know, today apparently there was good news, or sort of good news, or maybe good news, or some type of good news. But the conflict has worsened virtually every day for the last month. Beyond inflation, and we're going to ask about that separately, how is that conflict affecting the economy? How could it affect the economy? Will it affect the economy? And particularly the restabilization of the economy?
It's definitely going to affect the economy, and it's going to do it in a couple of ways. So you talked about inflation, that's the direct effect. You know, if you take a bunch of gas out of the supply, then you're going to have just scarcity, and that's going to push prices up. You know, those sorts of things, and that's going to be true in energy, it's going to be true in weeds, it's going to be true in fertilizer, which is going to flow through to a bunch of other things. Neon, like there are a lot of these things that we're going to see that. Now, there are two other things that I think are top of mind for me. One is just the uncertainty that it introduces into the world. Like, these are not things that people expected were going to happen. And when unexpected things happen, it's natural to wonder, well, what's the next unexpected thing that's going to happen? And that kind of uncertainty can then lead to a hesitancy to lean into things as much as you would otherwise. So in our space, it's we think a lot about aggregate demand. Demand is strong, and you need strong demand for markets and the economy to remain strong. Uncertainty is a risk to that because you could have people who say, well, since I don't know what's going to happen next month or 2 months from now, maybe I shouldn't go on that trip. Maybe I shouldn't buy that TV. Maybe I shouldn't go out to eat. And to the extent that that happens, that starts to slow the economy down, and it makes it less resilient and less robust. And so those are things that I'm watching carefully. You know, this is a time. You know, I actually am blessed in that I work for the Atlanta Fed, and that we have a lot of infrastructure in place to gather information about what's happening in the economy in real time. So, you know, the standard econ approach is you take the national data that the government puts out, you put it in a model, and then you figure out what the relationships are. Well, those numbers are really talking about things that happened 3 months ago, or 6 months ago, or a month ago. And in a world that's changing incredibly rapidly, that information is not going to be too useful. And so we do a bunch of things like in the field surveys that we're continually running with businesses to understand what they're seeing in terms of demand and supply. We always ask, like, how strong is your demand looking like? What are you projecting for this 6 months, 12 months into the future? And because they're on the ground, they're going to have much better intelligence on those sorts of things. So we have that kind of information. And so I'm confident that we will see changes in demand to the extent that they happen. They haven't happened yet, but the world moves fast, and so we want to think about that. So that's one thing, uncertainty. That's kind of much more psychological in terms of how it flows through into the economy. The second thing is it's something that actually started in the pandemic, but I think is going to accelerate, which is the stepping back from a ruthless pursuit of the purest forms of globalization. So, you know, the economic theory says, you know, if you want to maximize efficiency, you should produce the most product at the lowest cost. And so we've been trying over the last 30 or 40 years to get our production methods to that lowest cost model. Right, you think about you all probably heard about us talk about just in time. Just in time means you're going to have your one supplier that's a low cost provider is going to get the input there just in time for you to take it, put it into the production so that there's no hold time, there's no extra anything. And that will get you the lowest cost product. But what it also means is that you are actually more vulnerable to any kind of disruption. Because if every input has to get there just in time, if one doesn't get there just in time, you can't produce anything. And so you have much more variance and volatility in terms of how much product you can produce at any one time. and it's so the system and the production method is so refined that any kind of jarring perturbation or disruption winds up having wildly large impacts. All right. We started seeing this in the pandemic. So COVID, when we started seeing suppliers in Europe and in Asia having to shut down, we couldn't produce our goods here. So when you hear people talk about the supply chain, that's what the challenge is, that one input's not getting there in time. And what's happened for many businesses is that at first it was this input, and then it turned to this input, and then it turned to this input. So it was a cascade of disruption, which meant that it was very difficult to catch up, right? And so when we started talking to businesses maybe 18 months ago, they were all like, I hadn't really thought about this before, but this disruption, I don't really like this very much. And mainly because they felt like they were leaving revenue on the table, right? They had customers that wanted to buy goods and they couldn't fill that need, and they didn't want to ever have that happen again. And so they have now started to diversify their supply chains, to have multiple suppliers or location of productions. There are some of my businesses in my district are actually going to start opening factories in the United States as an alternative approach. But what this means, and the thing that we all need to understand, we are moving away from the lowest cost model, right? So costs are going to go up, right? But at the benefit of not having the same volatility in actual outputs. So we should get stability in the marketplace, but it comes with a cost. So that's what was happening with the pandemic. Now you go to the war in Ukraine, and it's going to happen again, right? So you see Germany is going to diversify its energy sources in a different way. A lot of the farming that was heavily reliant on Ukraine and Russia is going to start looking at multiple places to get these things. And that is just part and parcel of the same dynamic that going so ruthlessly to the one producer or provider, there's risk that comes with that. And in the first case, it was a pandemic. In the second case, it was geopolitical. But the outcome was exactly the same. Like, you couldn't get an input that you wanted to get. And so I think we are going to transition to more employers and more producers taking higher cost strategies as their baseline strategies. And that will have implications for what happens in the marketplace. But, and this is, I talk about this pretty regularly, businesses are deciding these things today, right? So I can't tell you exactly what the final outcome is going to be because the CEOs and CFOs, they haven't figured out what their final outcomes are going to be. And they have to make their decision before we can understand sort of what the final equilibrium is going to look like. So again, we're going to do our surveys, we're going to have conferences, we're going to have people come in, and we're going to ask, and we try to ask real topical questions. So we're going to ask, have you thought about diversifying your supply chain? At the beginning of the pandemic, the answer was no. Now the answer is pretty much 100% yes. And now the question is, now that you're thinking about it, what have you decided? Are you going to Are you going to stay with the old strategy? Are you going to diversify by using more international sources? Are you going to onshore some things? And that type of nuance will give us insights as to sort of how this change is going to flow through to various parts of the economy. So it's a lot. I mean, I do feel like we are very much at a turning point in terms of how the global economy has functioned. And you're actually seeing a number of experts across these fields talk about this. So Adam Posen, I think, at the Peterson Institute, just wrote a report basically saying that, detailing this and talking about how this is something that's going to, he uses different words, but the dynamic is basically the same. And so it's actually a very, very interesting time.
So we're moving from just in time to?
Just in case. That's what we call it. So we've coined that. So you can say, as they say at the Atlanta Fed, we're going from just in time to just in case. So.
I'm just here as a straight man, just to let you know. That's all. That was eloquent as always. The other day I went into Trader Joe's and I spent 30% more on groceries than I did 6 months ago, or maybe 3 months ago. I have a friend who got gas and got over $110 worth of gas. Is this, you say this is gonna have an impact. It seems like it's already having an impact. And how are you to get to inflation? Are we back in the 1780s? Are we
No.
back to a really bad spot? Are we in a sort of medium spot? Or are you optimistic about the world, Mr. President?
So I'm all right. So I'm optimistic by nature. So I was going to say that, but I'm now a central banker, and central bankers get paid to worry, right? So I'm optimistic and scared at the same time because that's kind of how the job goes. Here's what I would say. I think it's important for people to understand that the environment we have now is a very, very peculiar one. And it's not one that has any real historical analogs in the sense that we had a pandemic. The response to this pandemic was pretty extreme in terms of we wanted to get the public health handled, right? And the lockdown was really designed to handle the public health because if you don't get that settled, you can't get to the next page. And then the other thing that happened, which was really interesting and unexpected to many, was that the policy response was clear and it was strong. And that was not something that we've seen before, but that actually, I actually think it really helped prevent the worst possible outcomes of the pandemic from actually coming through. If you look at foreclosure rates, eviction rates, people becoming malnourished, child
Food
poverty
insecurity.
increase, business failures. We didn't see those at the numbers that were projected at the very outset of the pandemic, and that was because of policy, which leaves the economy today in a much stronger position because people who were precarious at the beginning of the pandemic didn't fall off the cliff. They're still consuming, they're still living in ways that are positive and useful. So that is an important thing as we think about sort of where we are today and how we can get out of this moving forward. So that's on the one side. Now on the other side, I do think that one thing that's been very interesting in the pandemic is that everyone has underestimated the pandemic. At the very beginning of the pandemic, we did a survey of businesses, and we asked them, this was in April of 2020, how long do you think this is gonna go, right? And the modal response was, we'll be done by September of 2020, right? I just wanted to be clear on that, right? This is now, March of 2022, and I would assert that we're not done yet. Right? We are still sort of working through a number of the challenges of the pandemic, and we're going to be working on it for a long time. And that has then led us to all have to reset our expectations about time and about how long things should take to get to another state. So right now what we're dealing with is trying to figure out how long is it going to take for supply chains to resolve? How long is it going to take for families to decide how they actually really want to attach to the labor market? One of the things that we saw in some of my researchers did some work and found that when you looked at a ton of jobs at the beginning, and then jobs started coming back and they've come back stronger than anyone expected. It's the 2 years, and we're basically very close to where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. But there are certain groups that have not come back in the same amount, and one group is women with young children. And why is that? Because childcare collapsed, and so the supply of childcare is far less than it has been before. There's uncertainty in the schools, and those things mean that some parent is going to have to stay with these children, and you can't start a job and then have the school shut down, then you have to leave. You can't be employed that way. And so all these people had started rethinking sort of how are they going to integrate their family into a working model. There are a whole bunch of other families where they got to be home for 2 years, a year and a half. They didn't spend on the commute money. They didn't spend on the child care. And they started doing the math and realized, one of the 2 salaries was covering commute and child care. Right? Do we need to still be doing those things? And so there's a lot of labor market sorting out that is happening as well. And there's a persistent question that's out around all the retirees. So we had, through the pandemic, we've had almost more than 1.5 million people retire, greater than what typically happens, right? And so there's a conversation we have in my building. Are any of them coming back, right? So wages are up. Is that going to be enough of enticement? Because when you talk to businesses, one of the things they tell us is that we have a labor shortage. So the labor shortage was not the primary issue, so it started supply chain. Now it's labor. And so now they got 2 things they got to worry about to try to figure out how they're going to meet this demand. And as these things resolve, things will get better. And so the question is, how fast is that going to take? I also think that, from my position, and my view has long been, in terms of our policy, that we did a lot at the very beginning. We reduced interest rates to 0. We started buying assets because I thought it was appropriate that we not be in a position where we had regrets, that we should have done more. And if we'd only done more, then these people wouldn't have lost their homes, and these businesses wouldn't have quit, and these communities wouldn't be damaged. Fully appropriate. I think we have to pull off of that. I think we actually have to get to a place where we're going to let the economy increasingly stand on its own. And that's the process we are going through now. I've been pretty strident on this for a while, and it's been my view that we needed to do this. But the uncertainty that we have, this new uncertainty that's been introduced, it has to cause us to temper our policies. Because if we move too aggressive, assuming that the world isn't going to change and then the world changes in other ways, we could push the economy into uncomfortable places and potentially recessions. And I really would like to not have any of those sorts of recessions while I'm sitting in this chair. So I'm going to do all that I can to make sure that that doesn't happen. But what that will mean is that we've got to I think it's appropriate to be a little more cautious as we get to a more neutral stance, which is ultimately where we need to get to. So the phrase I'm using, so I got to do a commercial, so hopefully you're all following me on Twitter and on LinkedIn, because you will get our messaging around how we're thinking about the economy in real time. And you can follow me, follow the Atlanta Fed, we put all the stuff out. But we just did a video about a month ago. They think I can act there. I'm really not a good actor. But it was a 30-second video where we talked, and the key phrase was observe and adapt. The world's going to change a lot, so we got to observe. We have to be hyper-observant, look in every nook and every cranny at an intensity perhaps that we may not have otherwise, and then be ready to adapt given what that information is. And that's really going to govern how I approach my information gathering, my thinking about policy, and then how I talk with my colleagues.
So in my weak attempt to get you back in the Financial Times, does that mean you're going to not be in favor of as many interest rate raises this year as you would have been a month ago, or that have been discussed in the last couple months?
So that's a very good question.
I mean, I'm not an economist, but I hear those things are important.
No. So here's what I would say on that. In December, my view was that we should raise probably 3 times in 2022. At the last meeting, my view had changed, and I was at 6 times in 2022. Some of my colleagues are at 9 times, 10 times, 12 times in 2022. I actually think, and I was 6 in 2022, 2 in 2023, and that total gets us to my estimate of neutral. All right, so I'm trying to get to neutral, and in the model I had, 6 in this year and 2 in next year would be fine, probably the early part of next year for the two. But the world is going to happen. And that will temper my view on how fast or how slow we should get that neutral. If things happen such that the economy looks stronger and stable and demand stays strong, I'll pull it all forward. Like, I won't have a problem doing that. If it turns out that this uncertainty causes families to start to be a bit uncomfortable and worried, and the things look like they're slowing down a bit, then I'll push some of them out. And so I'm not locked into any kind of trajectory, but I do think we need to get to neutral. So that part is not up for debate or negotiation. It's really a question of how do we do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the economy and cause us to start to contract, right? And I think that we have the ability and the tools to do this in a way that avoids a recessionary outcome.
I think if you had said 5, we'd have a better chance of getting into the Financial Times.
No, if I had said 7 or 8, that would have done more.
I'd like to change it a little bit and move us around a little. One of our really distinguished colleagues, Angus Deaton, and his Princeton colleague, Ann Case, have identified the tragic circumstances where a growing number of Americans in middle age, and often in rural areas, are dying of what they call deaths of despair, suicide, overdose, guns. In your time at the Atlanta Fed, you focused attention on this whole rural-urban divide. And at some level, I'm an urban planning professor. We do urban planning. But one thing that struck me more and more as I look at the world around me is this deep political polarization is often tied to geography. And at some level, I think that we need to start thinking about the rural areas differently than maybe we have during the great rise of the urban cities. And I was wondering how you at the Fed, at the Atlanta Fed, have focused attention on this. Is that economic divide between the rural and urban deepening? And what are the costs to our society if it is?
So this has been a question and an issue that has really informed and animated my whole time at the bank. I grew up in southern New Jersey outside Philadelphia. I went to school in Boston, Cambridge, worked in DC, went to school in the Bay Area, and lived here, right? All those things have one thing in common. They are not anywhere close to the district that I represent now. And so so my district is the state of Florida, the state of Georgia, the state of Alabama. I have the southern half of Mississippi, I have the southern half of Louisiana, and I have the eastern 2/3 of Tennessee. And so it is an incredibly diverse geography. I've got parts of Appalachia. I've got Miami, that's a huge international hub. I've got Atlanta that's booming. I have places that you probably have never heard of that used to be manufacturing centers. So you think about the out-migration of manufacturing in the 70s and 80s. The South was, a lot of smaller southern towns were losers in that experience. And so as I've gone around, and so when I first got there, my goal was to actually see my whole district. Like, go to all these places, see as much as I can, meet people, try to understand how these places work. And the thing that struck me was that they all work different. And they all have their own sort of dynamics and their own comparative advantages. And they do very wildly. So we started using a tagline, one district, many economies. Because if you go to Macon, Georgia, that's a different economy than Birmingham, Alabama, or Meridian, Mississippi, or Tri-Cities, Tennessee. And those are even small places, right? And that's not even trying to compare them to Atlanta and Nashville and Jacksonville, which are large and growing and vibrant, or New Orleans. And so we've really tried to appreciate the diversity of realities and experiences. Now, all that said, I think there you can put sort of a more general umbrella. Where is our returns to investment greater? They're definitely greater in large places, in large cities, and that's where young people are going, all these things. So the rural challenge is actually a challenge of coordination and repositioning. They've got to figure out what their comparative advantage is. They've got to come together to create a critical mass of resources, both natural and human, and then they've got to be unified in how they project themselves to the world. I could tell a lot of stories about the many places that in my district that know they're falling behind. They know their kids do not want to come back to live in these towns. They know that the major employers are increasingly despairing of being in these places. That is the source of a lot of the death of despair. People look and they're like, I don't have any future. There's nothing interesting or dynamic that's going to happen here. But then they got to come together and really be together. And I tell stories where I'll be talking to a coalition of 4 or 5 cities, 4 or 5 counties actually in these places. They're small, and say, look, you guys all have to figure it out. You have to be one unit. I know you're 5 counties. You have to be one unit. You cannot complain if a factory goes 15 yards on the other side of some street, because that just projects headache. And businesses do not want headache, right? And so if you're going to do these things. And so we are actually out in the field trying to work with communities to help them understand exactly what they think their challenges are, and then try to get them connected with others who can help them work through those, while also talking about the things that we're seeing as we go around. One other thing I would say is the urban-rural divide is real, but there is also an urban-urban divide, so which is almost identical in its form to the urban-rural divide. So it is very interesting. Some of the challenges that you'll see in sort of an inner city of some of these larger inner city neighborhood, they're the exact same challenges that I hear about in these rural towns, and it's very interesting. The way you're going to solve them is going to be different because proximity can help, but a lot of the networks that have built up, either professional work networks, personal networks, community networks, those have been established over the course of years and years and years. And so breaking those down and reconstituting them so that others get access to them can oftentimes represent a really significant challenge. So the challenge is very difficult in both places, but the types of solutions you would consider are going to vary a lot.
So the other thing that you have put a lot of emphasis on for a variety of reasons, and with the other 11 Federal Reserve Bank presidents, you presented a series of webinars and other events related to the challenge around race and economics. In remarks to the last of these events, you stated that you hoped through these events, quote, we are able to build some muscle of our own to ensure that we are good partners in spotlighting problems and disrupting flawed systems, so that ultimately race is no longer a predictor of life outcomes. How's it going?
I actually think it's going pretty well. So as a backdrop for this, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. They have one mandate is maximum employment, and the other mandate is stable prices. And as I go around, I see barriers that are preventing us from getting to real maximum employment. And so I feel it's important that we acknowledge what those barriers are and highlight them, because if we can solve that, then we get more people engaged in the workplace, we get more entrepreneurs, we get more small businesses, we get more of just about everything, which makes our job at the Fed a lot easier, right? Because the economy is just robust, it's resilient, and so I want to talk about those things. Now, we can't always solve all of them, but we definitely need there to be an awareness about the opportunities that we have collectively. That if we can fix these things, we can do great things. As part of that, one of the things that we have really worked on is trying to be aware of where we're not doing so well. Right? So it's easy to point at all those businesses out there and say, you guys, you should do more of this, that, and the other thing. But it turns out that there are a lot of those things that we don't do either, and we have not done. And so we are on a journey of our own to try to really understand how we can be better and how we can make sure that our policies are not creating tensions and challenges and stresses that are distracting people from actually investing in themselves and creating the skill set and the business plans and all those things that they might want to do. One example for us, and then I'm going to talk about this in terms of, I got a lot of examples, but I'll talk about this in terms of just salary scale. We had a policy at our bank that people would get reimbursed. So if there was any kind of work expense, people would pay it, and then we'll pay them back. Well, if you're living paycheck to paycheck or you don't have a lot of savings or anything like that, a reimbursement policy is actually burdensome. And for a business, for most businesses, they are indifferent about whether they pay it before or they pay it after. Right? So we just changed our policy, and we'll say we're going to pay it before across the board. We've also been looking at our salary scales to see it, to make sure that our salaries are commensurate to the markets in which people work. So I have 5 offices in addition to the Atlanta office. One of them is Miami, which is incredibly expensive. One of them is Birmingham, which is not incredibly expensive. We pay people exactly the same in both. And we have not really thought about the implications of perhaps having a Birmingham wage being paid to someone in Miami. That has implications for our turnover, our morale, our satisfaction, all these things that are actually part and parcel and central to how we do our work. And so we're starting to be much more intentional in all of these things in terms of how we approach our business and the areas that we work. And well, the thing that's interesting is that as we've been talking about it in our institution, my staff appreciates it, they understand it, and it actually really embeds and reflects the values that we say that we have. So, our values are excellence, integrity, and respect. And that came up before I started, so I didn't do that. But they really do encompass in a tremendous way the things that we want to lift up. We want to be excellent. We want to have integrity. And we want to treat everyone with respect. And we want to meet people where they are, create an environment, given that information, such that they can thrive. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish.
So let's talk a little bit more about your role in that. You're the first Black president of a Federal Reserve Bank. You're the first openly gay president of a Federal Reserve Bank, of which we are all very proud, as we have been proud of you since we knew you. How is that your pioneering status affected your leadership style, do you think?
So on one level, I like to think it hasn't affected it at all. Because, it's the way that you make these things not be things is by being good at the thing, right? And so if you're a good president, then you're necessarily a good Black president, right? And then people will think that there can be good Black presidents because you were a good one. So the focus has got to be on being just good at the job, investing in it and working at it and doing all that you can for that. That's really what I've tried to do. The areas where it does change is in terms of the things that I'm uncomfortable with that I have to sort of let happen. So when I go and talk at an event, a bunch of people want to come up and take pictures. I'm not a picture person. I had never really taken a selfie before. I have been in this, and I have taken thousands of selfies now because people are excited. They are, some of them are inspired, and I feel it's important to sort of indulge in that positivity and not have my discomfort and wanting to just move on to the next thing stop energy that is going to go way beyond that event or way beyond sort of me. And so those sorts of things have mattered. The other thing that that comes up a lot, this happens a lot actually. I get asked different questions than other people get asked, and it gives me an opportunity to really try to remind people that we're all in the same enterprise, right? And just because I have a different profile doesn't mean that I think about different things or I'm going to be radically different. But it also, so let me just step back and say another thing. One of the things that I actually really believe in terms of the teams that I work with is that if you're in the room, you are supposed to be in the room. And I expect you to contribute when you're in the room. And that's everyone. Now, whether that's because I'm a minority and a gay man or not, I don't know. But it's kind of how I am. And I really do believe that there's value for every person. Every person brings value because they have their own unique experience. And so we all are going to see the same thing in a different way. And that difference, if we leverage it and we facilitate it and we manage it, can allow us to get to a much better place. And I've had this experience professionally. The diversity that I first really engaged in this was ideological diversity. So the team I was working on, we had a hippie, a libertarian, and like a couple in the middle, and we had to find a way to come to consensus. Well, consensus, when you have those type of ideologies, means that all the trigger words or the catchphrases, they all get wiped out because someone gets triggered, someone sees the catch, and they get it out of the thing. And so those have been useful checks, and the diversity was how we got to the checks. And then the product winds up going out, and it's basically accepted by everyone because no one could find anything that pisses them off. And so they're like, oh, these guys, actually, that's good. They're legitimate. They're not playing favorites. They're not picking a side or any of those sorts of things. And so I really tried to do that and engage in that. And I'm really trying institutionally to make sure that we do that, which is very difficult. Because, and this is, I'm working on this myself, like truly leaning into diversity means that everyone should be uncomfortable at some point. There's going to be some part of the world that you don't know or you're not familiar with, and you're just going to have to find a way to live with that as part of your world. And it's a process, it's a journey, you're going to have to get through it, but living, I think I have been fortunate to be comfortable in chaos and not feel like I need to really iron it out and hammer it down and smother it, but let it just go and sort of have it take us where it will.
So just as a warning, in a few minutes, say about 10 minutes, 8 minutes, we're going to ask you to ask questions here and online. I have a little magic pad here with the questions. Before I do that, can I push back just a little bit?
Of course you can. You were going to anyway. He asked the question, and you're in charge.
Has the Federal Reserve done a lot of stuff over the years about race and economics?
No. So,
Does that just pop up out of nowhere?
So, no. So here, all right, so I'm going to talk about it like this. In our institutional journey, what we have tried to, let me step way, way back. There was a time when people felt like what happens outside the workplace, you should never talk about it. Put up a stone wall and just act like that's not real. But the reality is, the stuff that happens outside the workplace is always in the workplace. Because if people are troubled by it, if people are worried by it, when they walk in, you don't just turn that stuff off. And it will affect how you engage, and affect your commitment to the institution and how you do your work. And so we've really tried to encourage people to bring their whole self to work, be transparent, be open, and we are training our team and as I hope we're doing a good job at it, to be there for people so that they can just have that expression be expressed and get it out so that we can then move forward, right? And so what we've had over the last 2.5 years have been a series of events where different parts of my institution have been traumatized. George Floyd's murdered, African-American community, many others were troubled. The spa shootings of the Asian Americans, that was in Atlanta, right? So that was in neighborhoods around our bank where people were living. A bunch of people were super traumatized. Even the Cuban situation that was happening 18 months ago, another group was traumatized. So we've been in a place where the world was happening in ways that was hampering our ability to do our best work. And so we needed to speak to that. And it turned out that that reality was also true in many other parts of the system. So George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. We have a Minneapolis vet, right? And so you have all these places where we've become focal points for these issues. And it really did get a number of us to start talking about, what these are not just moral issues. So, I wrote my essay on the moral and economic imperative because this is an economic issue as well. And once we started talking about it, we thought there was a lot of opportunity to just highlight some of the economic implications of our challenges in this space. But we do this in a whole, so for me, I mean, people have pointed to this as like, this is the thing. I feel like we talk about all types of barriers to success and prosperity and access to opportunity. And we've been on that for a long time. The Fed has, and I have personally through the course of my career. And we have to figure this out. The world is incredibly competitive, and you need to have every resource that's at your disposal fully deployed, because others are trying to do that. And if we don't do that well, we are at risk of falling behind, and we cannot have that happen.
Good evening, Raphael. I'm Sunny Ostani. We know each other from Law Center.
Yeah, I know. Good to see you.
Good seeing you. I drove here from Malibu to ask one question, and that is, with the interest rates since financial crisis of 2008-9 continuously coming down, and then Fed buying Treasury bills and agency papers, keeping the long-term rates under control, how do you see the next recession happening? Because it's always been banking crisis, cash crunch, but it seems like we're not going to have that kind of a problem. Would it be a black swan event or?
All right, so Sunny,
that's my question.
Yeah, so I said at the beginning, I hope we don't have a recession while I'm in this chair. So that would be the first thing. I actually don't know the answer to this question. This is one, if you look at the last, X recessions, they all have kind of been different, right? We had a tech bubble, we had a housing crisis, we had a pandemic. They each really had their own different dynamic. And the thing that I'm hopeful for, and I take the great financial crisis as a cue here, policymakers were pretty surprised that happened, right? And to me, I think we have the resources to not be surprised. And we should be able to see risks as they emerge, and then it's incumbent upon us then to act to mitigate the deepest adverse effects. Now, we're not going to be perfect at that, and we're not going to always do this well. But I think that I'll say one other thing on this. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be a great financial crisis. It's not going to be housing the way it happened before. It's not going to be tech the way it happened before. It's going to be something else. And the spaces where I would want to look are places where technology seems to be, no, not technology. Technology can contribute to it, but where we start to see large divergence of realized prices and values relative to where they've been historically. Right? That's been a common theme across. They've emerged in different parts of the economy for different reasons. So in the housing crisis, for example, we thought that we could diversify away risk so that there wasn't really any risk. And there was a lot of, we'll say, fraud. On top of that, that together led to, and there was a lot of greed too, so I want to put that in there. Those led to a toxic combination that led to a collapse. The tech bubble was exuberance on the new in a way that led people to be willing to invest in a lot of things that were not getting revenues and were not having profits, and that can only go on for so long. And so those are the things that we should be looking for in the marketplace. And I think it's going to be someplace different.
Jeff
Keep it
Carr,
brief.
hi. The question is, with cryptocurrency coming along, is there a threshold where, is it just something like gold that'll kind of be there inert? Or is there a percentage of sort of the money supply, although is it money, is it not money, where the Fed has taken a position of this is something we need to have a strategy, a policy on? And if you personally have any thoughts about it. Thank you.
Oh, I thought that last one was I thought it was going a different way. So I do not own any cryptocurrency, which is what I thought you were going to ask. Yeah, so the crypto space, I'm glad you talked about it the way you did, as an asset as opposed to currency, because most of those markets are functioning much more like speculative asset markets as opposed to the way currency would typically operate. When I think about how I would approach this as a central banker, I talked about our dual mandates of maximum employment and stable prices. A third one got added more recently, which was financial stability. And so the question in the crypto space is really, for me, at what point does the activity there get to a volume or a level where financial stability is at risk, where there's so much volume and so much activity that if that market fell apart, we would then have serious problems and the system would fall down. That is not where we are today. And so in that regard, I don't think that there is, you're not gonna see the Fed start regulating crypto like tomorrow. But we have to monitor it, and as you know, and as most of you know, the volumes and the amount of engagement has grown incredibly fast, but is still not at the level of a systemic risk. So that's what we're going to look for. We have a ton of people in the system who are working on this, because if it ever gets there, we need to be ready to go. So we need to understand what's happening, but we're not there right now.
So let's take one from the web. How is the Fed planning to respond to the 10-year and 2-year bond yield curve inversion? His question also applies to the inversion of the 30-year and 5-year bond yield.
So did you understand anything in that?
I got a couple words in there.
So,
Thank God.
So I'll.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, no, that was good. That was very good. Yeah, actually, even with confidence. So yield curve. So you have bonds. You can buy bonds that mature over different lengths of time. So you have a 1 year, 6 month, 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year, 30 year, right? The longer that the term is, the more an investor should want in terms of their price for it. And that's the yield. So the yield on a longer termed bond should be higher than the yield on a short term bond. An inversion is when that doesn't happen, when the yield on the short term is higher than the yield on the long term. And what you'll hear in many business schools and from many econ classes is that when there's an inversion, that's a sign that the market believes that the economy is about to crash, that there's going to be some kind of recession. So that means do all your consumption and all your investment now, because all that stuff on the outside is not really going to pay. So don't do that. So in the dynamics today, if you look at a yield curve today, the 210 is, I didn't look at it today, but it's been very flat, right? Those yields have been very close to each other. And the 530 has also started to have some of those dynamics. And those are usually things that start to worry people. I think that this is a really odd time because we've had low inflation for a long time, as Sunny noted, which puts downward pressure on a lot of the curve. We are starting to raise rates, which is going to put upward pressure at the short end of the curve. And we have a lot of uncertainty in the world, which is causing the world to start to buy US bonds, which is putting downward pressure on lots of parts of the curve, right? And that combination of forces is not one that we have seen. For me, I'm going to look at the shorter end of the curve because that's the part that we control most directly, and make sure that we're managing that and understanding the sources underlying that. But it is definitely something we need to look at, but it is not the only thing we will look at. Yes, I have not talked about yields. I've been talking for a long time tonight. I've been talking much more about fundamentals of the market. Demand, production, supply. Those are the things that our mandates point to, and those are the things we have to focus on.
This side?
Yes.
It's ready.
Thank you. Dana Goldman. You talked about reducing uncertainty and diversifying supply chain, for example. One of the most extreme examples right now politically is in Western Europe, where dependence on Russian oil and gas, for example, has contributed to political instability. It is natural that energy policy ends up intertwined with foreign policy and domestic policy. In addition, you had a Fed nominee who had argued that we have these, controversially, that we have these global climate risks and uncertainty. So how does the Fed position itself, and where do you think the Fed should be positioning itself in terms of energy and climate policy?
So thank you for the question. I would say two places. So one is really understanding the risks that changing climate dynamics pose to assets, and mainly in the context of we are a bank regulator. We got to make sure that banks understand where their risks are and that they're holding adequate capital against that. And I live in Atlanta. I got the Gulf Coast. Before I got there, they weren't having Category 4 or 5 hurricanes every year. Now they're having them with increasing frequency. That changes the risk profile of anything that you own close to that, in terms of business, in terms of farm, in terms of real estate, all of those things. So like the pecan industry in southern Georgia was devastated because the hurricane came through right at the picking season. And it takes a pecan tree 7 years to mature to it before you're going to get the nuts. That's risk. That is real risk, and you have to make sure that we have enough insurance and enough capital held against those things. So we need to model that. We need to have businesses thinking about this, and we need to have businesses positioning themselves so they can be around after these risks realize themselves. So that's the one space. The second is really just to understand these industries so that we understand the implications for the economy when things happen. So you take natural gas, for example. The US could actually, from a pumping, drilling perspective, produce enough natural gas to fill in a lot of the gap in Europe. Unfortunately, we don't have the cooling machines that are required to liquefy the gas so you can load it on a ship so that you can then ship it to Europe. We have capacity constraint there. So even though we know that we can get the gas in the gaseous form, we can't convert it in a way that allows us to backfill those things. If we don't understand that, then we're going to have a different understanding or expectation about what pricing dynamics are going to be in the short and medium term as we invest to try to increase our capacity in that space. So I actually do spend a lot of time, we have, because I have Louisiana as part of my district, I spend a lot of time trying to understand energy markets. I've been out on the oil rigs and the offshore and all that kind of stuff, because when you see it, you get a much better appreciation for where the potentials are, where the risks are, and how changes in these markets are going to affect sort of the aggregate economy. So that's kind of how I think about it. We are not going to tell banks or anyone else that you should not invest in that company or this company. What we are going to say, if you invest in that company, know the risk of that company and make sure you're holding enough capital against that. So if you want to invest in an oil company, go ahead. That's fine by me. But just make sure that you understand where there's the same as you would say for any real estate developer or any other company, whatever you do, understand your risks.
Thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure and an honor for you to boil down the complicated issues that we're all dealing with as consumers. Having left here and gone into the financial world for the last 47 years, I have a question for you in reference to the national debt. What impact does the national debt have on the fundamentals, especially since you mentioned that there's 11 other governors that you have to work with? How do you get a consensus in reference to the national debt problem? Thank you.
There are actually 18 others, because there are 11 other presidents and then 7 people in D.C. The debt is not something that we manage. Right? We talk about the debt as an input to how the economy is working. And there are really 2 pieces to this. So one is debt in and of itself, I don't think is a bad thing. Right? I went into debt to buy my first house. Right, so going into debt to use it for a productive purpose can often make sense. So the one question is, if you go into debt, what are you using that money for? And is it a useful or worthwhile purpose? The Congress gets to decide those things. We hope, I put my trust in our policymakers that they will make good choices about what we're going to invest in, such that down the road, those investments bear enough fruit so that we can pay off and not have excess burden. So that's the one thing. The second thing is sort of making sure that we manage our debt in ways that are not detrimental. So you've heard the chair talk a lot about, when it's time to raise the debt ceiling, you need to raise the debt ceiling. And it goes back to where we started earlier about full faith and credit and trust and honoring your commitments. These are all the things that have been a hallmark of our country for hundreds of years, and it's why people are willing to invest in this country. It's why people are willing to support us as we're trying to make these longer-term investments. So we should not be doing things that undermine that, because that makes all of our jobs harder. Like, everything gets more expensive, negotiations get more difficult and tenuous, and that is a real significant issue. And your question actually takes us right back to sort of where you started us tonight around the issue of trust. And people are not going to give you money with the promise of paying it back in the future if they don't trust you. They don't believe in you and your institutions and your collective ability to continue to do the things that you've done in the past. And so we really have to protect that. And we collectively need to make sure that all of us are doing our part to make sure that that happens.
So as we come near to the end, based on your career, do you have some specific career advice for some of our students and young professionals? And I guess I would ask, say, what it's like not to be the first choice.
So he has leading questions. So it was interesting. Twice in my career, I know I was the third choice for a job I wound up getting. And you know what, that's all right. In the sense that, you can choose to get a chip in your shoulder about how you get somewhere and how you go about doing the things that you're going to do, or you can just do them and do them in a way that people feel like it was my mistake that we didn't have him or she as the first choice. And if you do that, and actually I was going to say something that's not true because it happened again, but you're less likely to be the third choice in the future. Less likely, it's not impossible that you will. But those are the things that matter. I mean, one thing I really try to tell people, and it's hard, is focus on what you can control and then control it. And make the stuff that you control sort of rock solid, locked in, and everything else, things will happen, you won't, but you never control those things. And I find, and I learned this the hard way, so the story I tell is my aunt, she had gout, she had arthritis, she had basically every ailment you could possibly imagine. And I would go visit her, and she would want crab legs and all these things that you're not supposed to have. And so I yelled at her. We used to have wrestling matches for a decade. And then one day, I don't know what it was, but I stood back and I was like, you know what? She's a nurse. She actually knows. And she's choosing to do this. So if she's going to choose it, I can't control this. I got to let it go. And it was very hard to let it go, but that was a real lesson. And my life was a lot better. I had a lot more energy to devote to other things, and she was happier, and we got along better, and we were great. And so I've tried to take that along in my career, and it's been very, very helpful. It's as a leader, it's very helpful because people don't see you as panicked. Right? They see you as focused on the things you can control and with the confidence that you're going to get through it, because you are. And that's kind of how I think about it. So all right, be excellent. So let's start at the beginning. So be excellent, but really try to focus your energy. I didn't really think about that until this job. This job, I'm watched every moment, like every moment. And so it takes a lot of energy, so I can't afford to be using it in other things that are not going to be helpful. And I really try to stay focused on that.
So I'd like to end with a very quick story. A number of years ago, Raphael and I were teaching on Monday nights. So we have classes from 6 to 9:30. And there was a young man who was an assistant professor, and he was struggling. And Raphael came up to me and to this person and said, "How you doing?" We had a little chat. And he said, "Let's go out for a drink." And so we went out, went across the street, it was closed. We went up to another place, it was closed. We went to a third place and got a drink after about 25 minutes. And we looked at each other and said, "This is stupid. Why do we want to go out? Let's just get a bottle of wine and a few glasses and open them up." And so every Monday night for a semester, we had wine and cheese in this young man's office. And I got to watch Raphael mentor him in this extraordinarily beautiful way. And I had always known from the moment I met him, when I was on the search committee that hired him, that he was an amazing guy. But during that semester, I learned about his humanity and his firmness at the same time. And I have to say, he still is one of my key people that I go to be mentored. And I am very glad to have him back at USC. So thank you, President, for coming to our home.
Thank you. Very good to be here.